On July 16, 1973, 21-year-old Conchetta Serra, who went by Penny, took the day off from her job as a dental assistant to go shopping in New Haven, Connecticut. She borrowed her father's car for the excursion and parked it on the 9th level of the Temple Street garage just before 1 p.m. Then, 2 teenagers witnessed Penny running away from a man. They believed she had gotten away from him because they saw him run back to the car a few moments later, holding something shiny in his hand. Penny had not gotten away. She had tried running up a staircase, but her attacker had reached her after she made it up just a few steps and stabbed her once in the chest. Penny's body, curled in the fetal position, was then left in the narrow concrete staircase. Penny had been, at least in part due to circumstances, very mature for her age. She lost her mother, Pauline, to cancer in 1963, at the age of 11. Penny then assumed many of her mother's responsibilities in order to keep the family home running smoothly while her father continued running the break center he owned. She cooked meals, decorated the family home, did the shopping, and cared for her beloved younger sister, Rosemary. Penny's father, John Serra, would say in 1984 that Rosemary had been 100% dependent on her older sister, but his friends and family said he too relied on Penny just as much. After John was notified of his daughter's death, he was unable to eat or leave his house for several days. Perhaps because of her maturity, Penny had dated a man who was 7 years her senior. The couple was engaged to be married, but Penny had broken off the relationship because of their frequent arguments. Police looked at Penny's ex as a potential suspect early on in their investigation, but he had an alibi corroborated by numerous witnesses, and his fingerprints did not match ones in evidence. Decades later, DNA evidence would also exclude him. Furthermore, the evidence at the parking garage indicated that Penny had not been killed for personal reasons. She appeared to have been killed after someone tried to steal her father's car. The car was a blue 1971 Buick Electra that, by all accounts, was a very nice vehicle that could have been attractive to a car thief. 2 weeks before she was killed, Penny had driven the car to Florida for a vacation. She had brought a knife with her that she had used to slice bread and cheese on the trip, and it was known to still be in the car. However, the knife was not there when police processed the car. There was also a blood trail throughout several levels of the garage, and blood in the car. Police believed that someone came up to Penny to steal the car, and she stabbed him with the knife from the car in self-defense, most likely on his left wrist, based on the blood trail evidence. This apparently angered her attacker, as he chased after her, as witnessed by the 2 teenagers, instead of just taking the car after she fled. After stabbing her in the staircase, he did steal the car, but became disoriented and could not find his way out of the double-tier parking garage. He therefore abandoned the Buick on the garage's 7th level, where it would later be found, leaving its keys and Penny's handkerchief, both covered in blood, on the ground nearby. He then left a blood trail on the 6th and 5th levels as he went to retrieve the car he had driven to the garage. Shortly after Penny was seen running for her life, a man, believed to be her killer, drove up to exit the garage and handed the attendant a bloody parking ticket. The attendant asked the man, who appeared to be injured, if he needed help, but he said no. The attendant then simply wiped away the blood to see how much the man needed to pay him. He did not take note of the car's license plate as it rapidly drove away after the man paid the parking fee. There had been 2 security guards assigned to the garage that day, but they had gone across the street to get a cup of coffee together at the time of Penny's murder. John Serra sued the owners of the garage for negligence, and ultimately settled with them out of court for $200,000. $30,000 of that money was offered as a reward for information that led to the arrest of Penny's killer. The rest of it went towards John's personal investigation into the case. For at least the first decade after his daughter's murder, John Serra worked 8 hours a day on the case, in addition to running his business full-time. He called the police multiple times a day, and did provide them with some leads that kept the investigation active. He hired a lawyer and a private investigator. He spent his evenings driving the streets of New Haven and visiting the parking garage. He would look at the left wrists of every man who came into his business or he passed on the street, trying to find a scar that could have been from the wound Penny inflicted on her killer. When none of these efforts identified the murderer, he began consulting with psychics. Every year on the anniversary of Penny's murder, John would take out an ad in the New Haven Register with his daughter's picture and a reminder that her killer had still not been found. The case appeared to be solved in 1984 when an arrest was finally made in the case. Anthony Galino had attended high school with Penny and was therefore one of the thousands of people interviewed by the police in the years following her murder. By 1981, they had begun focusing in on him. Galino's ex-wife came in to speak with the police about him. Galino had been physically abusive towards her and had once threatened to do to her what he had done to Penny Serra. He would deny ever making such a statement. He also had a scar on his left wrist, where it was believed that Penny had stabbed her killer. He was arrested for Penny's murder on July 3, 1984. When Galino was arrested, he told police his blood was type O, which was the same type as the blood left at the crime scene by the killer. However, they never tested his blood to confirm this. The test would not be performed until May of 1987, right before the start of his trial. Galino actually had type A blood. This eliminated him as a suspect, and the murder charge against him was dropped. According to Galino's attorney, the damage the arrest caused ruined his client's life. Galino died of cancer in 2008 at the age of 57. In the 1990s, authorities again thought they had found Penny's killer, an Albanian immigrant who worked in a restaurant Penny frequented and was a patient at the dental office where she worked. 2 of his dental bills had been found in the Serra car, and the lot attendant believed the man who had given him the bloody ticket had an accent. On 2 separate occasions, a year apart, authorities had applied for warrants to arrest him, but each time the judge refused to sign them due to a lack of evidence. Despite his years of fighting for justice for his daughter, John Serra would not live to see her killer arrested. He passed away in 1998 at the age of 74. Even as he was dying, he continued to advocate for Penny. He called Dr. Henry Lee, the forensic scientist who had been doing work on Penny's case, from his hospital bed, begging him not to forget about Penny after he was gone. At the time of that final conversation, Dr. Lee did have a strong possible suspect, but he was unable to tell John Serra about him. A bloody, unidentified fingerprint had been found on a box of tissues inside the car Penny had been driving on the day of her murder. Police had never been able to find a match to it until 1997. That year, a new search was run and finally identified it. It was the right thumbprint of a man named Edward Grant of Waterbury, Connecticut. Grant's fingerprints had not been in any criminal database until 1994, when he was arrested for domestic violence against his then-fiancée. However, authorities did not want to arrest Grant based just on one fingerprint, so further forensic tests were performed. In addition to the fingerprint, the other main piece of evidence in the case that had been preserved was Penny's handkerchief, which was found near the car. It was stained with blood from Penny and from an unknown male, presumably her killer, who was believed to have been injured by Penny. The DNA from the blood on the handkerchief was a match to Grant's DNA. In addition, chemical analysis of paint chips found inside the Buick tied them to the auto body shop Grant had owned at the time of Penny's murder. On June 24, 1999, less than 8 months after the death of John Serra and almost 26 years after the murder of Penny Serra, 56-year-old Edward Grant was arrested for the crime. Grant maintained his innocence and claimed that he had been in Vermont on July 16, 1973. He did also acknowledge in court documents that he was involved in a Jeep accident in 1964 while serving in the Connecticut National Guard, and that he sustained a serious head injury that required the placement of 4 metal plates in his skull. Following this injury, he suffered from memory lapses and mood swings. At trial, his attorneys argued that there was no identified motive for their client to kill Penny, and that the evidence had been in storage for too long before it was tested for DNA. Grant's trial lasted 20 days. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Grant guilty of Penny Serra's murder on May 28, 2002. Rosemary Serra was in the courtroom when the verdict was read and wept when she heard it. After this many years, my family can finally rest in peace. My father had faith in the system, and now I can too, she said as she left the courthouse. Grant was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He still maintains his innocence and remains incarcerated at the MacDougall Walker Correctional Institute. "34-year-old Freddie Farah was a loving husband to his wife Nadia and doting father to his son and 3 daughters. He owned the Grand Park Food Store on Kings Road in Jacksonville, Florida, and was working there on May 22, 1974. Around 2 p.m. that day, a tall and thin African-American young man came into the store and asked Freddie where the frosting was. Freddie pointed him in the right direction. The young man picked up some items and then came up to the register, placing a box of cake mix, a can of frosting, and an open can of soda on the counter. He then asked what the total he owed for the items was. However, instead of paying for his items, the young man took out a gun, pointed it at Freddie's head, and demanded money. Freddie brought his hands up, and the gun went off. Freddie was shot in the head and died from his injuries. His killer fled the store on foot, without taking any money from the register. Freddie's children were just 11, 8, 6, and 5 at the time of his death. So many details of the murder are known because there was a witness to it in the store that day, 14-year-old Annette Bryant. Fingerprints were also found in the items the killer had left behind on the counter, but no match to them was found in 1974. Even with the fingerprints and an eyewitness, Freddie's killer was not found, and the case went cold for more than 40 years. In 1998, the fingerprints were again run through the automated fingerprint identification system, but again, no match was found. In 2016, they were run through APHIS again, but this time they found a match. 2 fingerprints found on the can of frosting, 1 fingerprint from the box of cake mix, and a palm print on the can of soda, all belonged to a 59-year-old named Johnny Miller. Miller had been just 17 years old at the time of Freddie's murder. Sometime after it occurred, he had moved to New Orleans, where he had gone on to be a popular street performer in the French Quarter, known as Uncle Louis. His prints were on file as a result of a number of arrests for minor offenses. Before speaking with Miller, investigators re-interviewed Annette Bryant, who was then Annette Bryant Williams, to make sure she remembered what she had seen that day in 1974 well enough to still testify. She still remembered the crime in great detail. Detectives traveled to New Orleans to interview Miller, who denied any involvement in Freddie's murder and could not recall ever going into his store. Still, he was arrested on May 16, 2017, and sent back to Florida on July 26th. He received support from New Orleans locals and tourists from around the world who had met him in the French Quarter. They raised $6,000 to help with his legal fees. On August 15th, a grand jury in Duval County indicted him on 1 count of first-degree murder. A deposition of Annette Bryant Williams was scheduled for January 18, 2018, as a part of the preparations for Miller's trial. Unfortunately, she passed away unexpectedly in December of 2017 at the age of 58. Without Annette, the case against Miller almost completely fell apart. Prosecutors could still present the fingerprint evidence, but only Annette's testimony could have tied the items left on the counter to the person who killed Freddie. They therefore offered Miller a deal that was approved by Freddie's family. If he pled guilty to second-degree murder, he would be released, serving only the time he had been held awaiting trial. However, there was another major condition to the agreement. Miller would have to meet with the Farah family and truthfully answer all of the questions they had about the crime. Miller met with the family on April 20th, 2018. He told them that he actually knew Freddie fairly well because he visited his store regularly, sometimes multiple times a day. He told them stories about how friendly Freddie had been and how he would let kids who came in to buy snacks have the items they wanted even if they did not have quite enough money to pay for them. He claimed that on the day of the murder, he had simply found the gun somewhere and wanted to show it to Freddie. When he got to the counter, he had a sudden urge to rob the store. The gun went off accidentally when Freddie tried to swat it away. After running away in a panic, he had thrown the gun onto a train car. Miller answered all of the questions the family asked him. The Farah family was convinced by some of the details Miller provided that he was telling them the truth. He also apologized to them dozens of times during the meeting, and the family ultimately decided to accept his apology. With this condition of the plea deal met, the arrangement was finalized at a court hearing on April 25th, and 61-year-old Miller was released from custody, having served only 344 days for Freddie's murder. He returned to New Orleans and to performing as Uncle Louie, and remains a beloved member of the community there. While the short jail sentence is not what the Farah family had been hoping for, they are grateful to finally have answers to the questions that have bothered them for more than 4 decades. Am I upset that he is not spending time? I'd rather him answer my questions and give me the answers that I have been looking for all my life than to have him sitting in jail without anything, Freddie's son Bobby told the Florida Times-Union. That being said, Bobby will not tolerate Miller going back on the plea deal. Should Miller ever recant his confession, Bobby Farah has vowed to travel to New Orleans and follow Miller around the French Quarter as he tries to work, with the sign reading, "This man killed my father." On May 20th, 1987, 2 truckers were driving out of Columbia, South Carolina, on Highway 378. As they passed through the town of Hopkins, they spotted what appeared to be a body in a ditch along the side of the highway, approximately a quarter of a mile down the road from the entrance to the McIntyre Joint National Guard Base. They immediately notified the authorities. When police arrived, they found what would later be described as a very gruesome scene. The body was of a woman who had been shot in the face with a shotgun at close range. She appeared to have been killed at the location where she was found. Her untied shoes were found nearby. She did not have any identification with her, but she was eventually identified as 34-year-old Patricia Ann Green. Patricia was a mother of 3 who lived in downtown Columbia with her children as well as her sister. Police had no leads in the case, and it almost immediately went cold. Evidence from the scene was collected and preserved. The investigator initially assigned to Patricia's case was Bill Simpson of the Richland County Sheriff's Department. At the time he was assigned the case, he had just notified the department that he would be leaving it for another position elsewhere. While he only worked on Patricia's case for a brief time, he would remain haunted by it for the next 3 decades. In 1997, the Richland County Sheriff's Department formed a cold case unit to look into old cases that had never been solved. By the beginning of 2017, they had solved 10 such cases. Jeff Fuller was a member of the unit. He had worked violent crimes with the Sheriff's Department early in his career, leaving the department in 1988 to join the State Law Enforcement Division. After his retirement from his position there, he returned to the Sheriff's Department to join the cold case unit. In February of 2017, Bill Simpson called Jeff Fuller to ask for the unit to look into Patricia's case. Despite the fact that the case was almost 30 years old, Bill was still bothered by the fact that it had never been solved, and haunted by its gruesome details. Jeff Fuller agreed to take the case on, and within just a few weeks, it would become the 11th case closed by the cold case unit. DNA evidence was not widely used by the police at the time of Patricia's murder. In 2017, the preserved evidence from the case was re-examined in hopes that DNA could be found on it and identify a suspect. DNA was found on some of Patricia's clothing, and when it was run through a criminal database, there was a match: 53-year-old Philip Johnson. Johnson was already serving 4 life sentences at the Kirkland Correctional Institution. In 1988, he had been arrested for, and later convicted of, the murder of 4 women in Sumter County. Patricia Green's murder had occurred right in the middle of his spree. 2 of the women had been killed before her, and the other 2 were killed after her murder. The 4 murders Johnson was in prison for had all occurred within the same area. Patricia's murder hadn't been connected with these cases because it occurred far outside that area, in the next county over. Investigators from Richland County went to Kirkland to speak with Johnson, who confessed to the crime even before he was told that DNA evidence had been found and implicated him in the crime. He was able to provide details about the murder that only Patricia's killer would have known. When he was asked what the motive for the murder had been, he said that there hadn't been one. He had been on a killing spree, and to him, Patricia Green had just been another person whose life he could take. The solving of the case was announced by Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott at a press conference on March 8, 2017. Patricia's family was notified before the announcement was made, and while they are relieved to finally have closure, they opted not to speak publicly about the case.